All right, guys, welcome to the SAML training. The primary audience today is for Centrify developers and support, and really just about everyone. I gave this training 2 years ago, but something has changed, so I have made some updated content, and therefore might as well also invite adaptive people, so you can see them here, that's why. So this whole series is broken down into 3 parts. Today is the first part that I will go over what SAML is and how it works and some of the pieces. Might be a little dry, a lot of textbook materials today. Tomorrow will be, I think, the fun part, that we actually will look at how Centrify Cloud, more so using our SAML application template to actually integrate with a SAML service provider, which is the application itself. And there will also be a lab exercise too, so we'll actually get some hands-on things to play with. Then on the 3rd day, it will be about troubleshooting. So that session was actually, it was first made for support, but developers could, of course, also benefit from that. So go through, like when things go wrong, like what to do. So that'll be the 3rd day. Okay, so let's get started with SAML specifications. Okay, long story short, what I'm all gonna cover was really just for what SAML it is itself, really, right? And all the pieces, like these are the things that you could look online. It all goes back to the original SAML specifications, which I'm showing you the link here. And for the whole set of specific documents, this is the link to get the zip file, which contains all the specification itself, different areas, as well as the XML schema that are being used behind the format is all there. So this link, of course, is also on the website. So when you ever need anything, or ultimately go back to that to get the specifications. Meaning, as in, like, if you guys ask me some questions that I actually don't know, I go back to the specifications and see what they say. Now, something to note about the specifications are, it defines the protocol, the format of the messages to be communicated, but there are some, it's kind of like a framework that it tells you what needs to happen, sometimes what should happen. It will give you recommendation, but there are actually gray areas that are ultimately up to a service provider and IDP to agree with each other. So I'll explain more later on with this, but this is the ultimate source, is the specifications themselves, as well as SAML 2 has been around for many years. So there are actually also other materials that you can read about and learn from. So I'm just throwing that part front. Okay, now what is SAML? Well, here's the textbook stuff. That is an XML-based open standard for exchanging authentication and authorization data. Now you can read all these later. I'll be honest with you, like this part, these contexts are actually we copy from somewhere else. Right, it's because the textbook stuff. What I want you to take away from this one, though, is actually just look at the simple picture down here. Like this is the highest level possible, right? It's really just between it's a open standard between Centrify as a SAML identity provider and an application as a SAML service provider, right? And the messages that being sent are in between the two parties are in XML format. Now, what will be contained inside the XML format is the meat of the whole thing, and through configuration we'll make that happen. But at a high level, that's really it, right? An analogy I like to make to people is imagine, right, just you and I, right? We want to send letters to each other, like secret letter, maybe not love letter, but just secret letter, right? So what I need to know from you in order for me to send a message to you, right? And even more so, for this on the security side, hey, your signature is supposed to show to prove who I am, but hey, signature could be forged also. So what could be done to make this communication secured? Over HTTPS aside, there will be something else, namely certificates, that we will use as part of the message. So only we know we can verify signature on each other, then know that I can trust you and therefore process the authentication part. So it's really just, in my opinion, it's really just down to sending a message between the two. The important part is what we need to know to send. So we'll see that in a bit. So here's the workflow, how SAML authentication works. So back to the same thing, right? You'll have, say, service provider, which is one of the applications. We internally, at least on my side, we like to use Salesforce as an example. But of course, there are all other applications out there who support SAML, then they are effectively a SAML service provider. And on the other side, as Centrify, we are the identity provider. And we're throwing a new piece here. Technically speaking, there's the browser here, which really represents the user. So, and at the end of the day, how it's going to work is, well, let me put it this way first. Without IDP, right? Without SAML single sign-on, it normally just a user via browser, web browser, for example, going to, say, Salesforce, and I enter my username and password. So that's only between the two of them. But now that, hey, we throw in a identity provider, right, in between, then the user will eventually be authenticated by the IDP, not directly to SP. But the trust relationship goes like this, right? In order for A and C in this diagram, which is the user and, say, Salesforce, right, to trust each other with going through IDP, is really, right, here's the logic written out in the middle. They say A trust B, right? That's SAML integration between Centrified and a service provider, and B trust C, right? Well, C is effectively a Centrified customer, and therefore A trust C. So that's the logic. Now here's the visual, right? So let's say if I go to, say, Salesforce, and Salesforce knows that, hey, there's a SAML single sign-on configured, I am not the one to authenticate you. So please go to IDP for authentication. So then the user will be redirected to IDP, in this case, Centrify, and Centrify validates the user. However, that configuration is being done behind the scene. So in this diagram, we drew cloud connectors, right, which could be one in turn on top of, say, AD or LDAP. Nowadays, there's also Cloud Directory Service or any other kind of validation behind the scene, right? But once that is done, then Centrify will send the user back to service provider. And then the service provider validates the message, and then the user will be logged into the application. So we'll see this diagram again with more detail. So here's an example. Like I said, we like to use Salesforce. In fact, tomorrow we'll be playing with Salesforce as well. So for those who use Salesforce. How many of you use Salesforce? Not that I can tell how many of you are raising your hands, but
Raise your hand.
it's one of the app in Kibble, right? Okay, so let's say, okay, I as a Salesforce user, well, more so Salesforce at Centrify, right? So I'll go to that URL, centrify.my.salesforce.com. And because Centrify IT has configured SAML between that Salesforce account, Centrify Salesforce account to Kibble. So Salesforce will send me to Centrify, and then Centrify authenticates me, right? Either with whatever method. If IWA is set up when I'm within, right, I'm within the company network, then that's great. That's seamless. If I'm outside, there's an MFA configure. I go through that. That's great. After that's all that set, it's done. Then I've logged into Centrify. Then Centrify will redirect me back to Salesforce with a SAML token. That Salesforce knows, right, because of pre-configuration, if you will, right, be able to validate the token and know that, hey, it is me trying to single sign-on into Salesforce. And because Salesforce trusts Centrify, and Centrify trusts me, so Salesforce trusts me also, and let me in. Okay. Now, for those who use Salesforce, how many of you actually go to centrify.my.salesforce.com first? Even if so, how frequent? I don't know how many of you are raising your hands again.
Never.
But I can tell you from, right? So for myself, I actually go to Centrify first. Because, well, at least for me, right, my Kibble is actually always on, and it already has IWA. So it's really convenient for me just, right, go into user portal, go to Centrify, and then click on the Salesforce application that has already been set up, right? Then I'm in, right? So that's another way how this could happen. And if you notice, in this diagram, there are fewer arrows. So what's happening here is there are actually two types of SAML single sign-on. One, the first one that I showed you is called SP initiated single sign-on. And the second one is IDP initiated single sign-on. Now that's a term, but really just, read it. The adjective itself, SP initiated, meaning that single sign-on workflow is initiated by SP, right? So in the first example, if I actually go to Salesforce first at that URL, then they redirect me to IDP. That's what it means by single sign-on initiated by SP. In the second case, if I go to Centrify user portal first, right, and I click on the Salesforce SAML app, that single sign-on workflow is initiated by IDP. That's all there to it. But it is important because a service provider may or may not support both of them. So this one is totally up to the SAML implementation of a service provider. Some of them only support SP initiated single sign-on. Some, such as Concur, or as far as I know, that they only support IDP initiated single sign-on. Some service providers support both, meaning both can happen at the same time. Some support both, but only either can be effective at one time. Okay, so all four combinations. It's up to service provider to like how they implement SAML. But that's the two types of SAML single sign-on. So imagine back to the diagram, you can see that in the case of IDP initiated single sign-on, the workflow is actually pretty much the same, right? It's pretty much the second half of the SP initiated single sign-on workflow. So it's actually, well, in terms of, the redirection, there's actually no redirection in IDP initiated single sign-on because it's just one way from IDP to SP. Okay, so far so good? Okay. All right, then moving on. So I've shown you the workflow, right, to send, I said earlier, a message. Like in the example of you and I sending each other the letter, right? I've only talked about actually how to send it, right? Send it to, and there's redirection in between. But what about the message itself? Like what is being sent? Because that's all the important stuff inside is inside this. So, okay, one of the term is SAML token. There are different ways describing it. You will also hear the SAML assertion, and then there's also SAML response. They're probably referring to the same thing, and I'll show you why in the next slide. So here's the textbook stuff. The SAML assertions contains all these statements, and it could be less or more, depends on how the agreement between the two parties. IDP is also known as SAML authority, and there are many things that can be concluded from the configuration itself. Once again, it depends on the implementation on service provider side, but here's the high level. There's of course authentication. And then there's also something called attribute, more specifically SAML attributes, which I will cover later on in this session, actually. Is if service provider needs some supplementary information, then they will be sent out in SAML attributes and IDP. And so service provider is supposed to tell identity provider, hey, what attributes I'm expecting, and then identity provider is supposed to follow it and send that information out. Authorization decision, once again, depending on how the contents of a SAML response is being set up, and more information could be passed from IDP to SP so that SP can make a better a decision of what to do with this user, including authorization decision. And then the last two bullets, let me just summarize it by saying the contents of SAML response could, once again, depending on what service provider asks for, it could be shorter or longer. So there are little sections that it could exist one time or multiple times. It also, once again, all that it depends on how service provider will take that in. And the outer structure, which I will also show you in the next slide, is provides some other information about IDP. So let's take a look at it. So don't be intimidated by this. This is what just the message looks like. In this case, why it's called SAML response, right? Like I said earlier, it is an XML document, right? That's why the structure, or the pointy arrows, I'm sorry. I thought I could highlight. So in the XML, in a valid XML format, if you open an element, you have to close it, that kind of thing. So it is called SAML response because, well, guess what? The root element is response. So when people talk about SAML response, this is it. Now, what about assertion? Assertion is actually a part inside SAML response. So you can see like this block here, right? That's assertion. And inside is where it contains a very important piece of information called name ID, which is in turn in an element called subject. This is where the identity value gets passed on, right? So it's inside assertion. That's why assertion is so important. There are also other information, right? That's the outer structure. The last bullet, the last slide was talking about, say, issuer. I'll tell you what this is later on. But issuer, well, I'll give you a preview then. Is to, right, like who issued this SAML response, which in this case is IDP, therefore is centrify. Okay, so this one I just want to show you this structure, what it looks like. I make a little diagram in the corner here. So this is the, you know, when we talk about SAML response, the whole thing, all right? And you talk about SAML assertion, depends on how technical your audience is. They might simply mean this whole thing, but now, well, you know better that by looking at the this XML itself, assertion is ultimately just a part of the response. And then this example I have here actually does not have any attribute statement. But if there's any attribute statement, it would be inside the assertion block. Actually, right below the auth statement at the end here. Okay, so that's what a SAML response is. And a SAML response is the message that IDP sends to SP. We'll revisit that too. Okay, now here's another type. Now I just told you SAML response is sent from IDP to SP. What about in the SP initiate a single sign-on scenario, right? SP goes first. SP redirect the user to centrify. They actually send something called SAML request. I don't have to think too much. Well, SAML single sign-on, requesting for SAML single sign-on, just like that. And it's usually way shorter than a SAML response because, right, there's no like identity value or signature and certificate that we'll get to that soon enough. So this is what it looks like. The root element is actually per specification is actually authentication request. All right. So if you hear anyone talk about authent request, right, this is probably it. But of course, double check. And that's a piece of issuer here, which specifies who is issuing this request. So in this case, that is SP. In this example, it's Salesforce. Okay, there's another piece of data involved called relay state. This is usually used in SP initiative single sign-on because by definition, it is a piece of data that service provider generates on their side, and then they send it along with SAML request to IDP. And IDP normally is supposed to relay it back to service provider along with SAML response, unaltered, untampered. So once again, just look at the word itself, relay state, stage to relay. That's what it is. That's why this IDP is not supposed to change it. It's just something that service provider give IDP and simply asking them per specifications to return that piece of data when they come back. This is optional. It is not always used. If service provider says, hey, they don't use it, they don't send it out, then it is not used. Now, how it is used though, like what goes in this real estate value? SAML specifications actually do not dictate what it is. If I recall correctly, not even suggest what it is. It is up to service provider to decide, right, how they want to use it, and therefore send it out, and when IDP receives it, simply return it back. Now, but there could be special case that, and the specifications does not stop that, is there are very few cases where service provider, even in the scenario of IDP initiated single sign-on, ask you to send them a real estate for their own reason. But when they ask for that, then we simply follow that by adding that to our configuration. So that doesn't happen very often, but when it happens, don't be surprised, because at that point it will be a requirement by service provider. So, but still, there's some like common usages of real estate that have been implemented by service providers out there. The common one is landing page URL. So the example would be when SP initiated single sign-on, they want, in order to determine when the user goes through the whole workflow all the way, then eventually come back to service provider, they want to know that, hey, where this user came from, right? If the user, let's say Salesforce, if the user goes to Salesforce and try to access some protected resource, right, then Salesforce will redirect the user to Centrify. Then, just for an example, they will put that return URL, right? Hey, where did this user was asking for this protected resource? They put that in a real estate. So after single sign-on via Centrify pass back the same real estate value. Then when Salesforce gets it back and look at it, hey, oh, this is where the user came from. This is what the resource the user was asking for originally, so I'm going to land that user over there. So that's one common usage. And then the other one is for additional security. If they still do that, Box does that. Box for one does that. So in the case of SP initiated single sign-on, they will generate some random number on their end, and they put it in real estate. And after single sign-on, some response being sent to them, and the real estate happens to be a different value, they will throw an error saying that, hey, when I send out the SAML request, this is not the value that I made. No, they didn't spell it out that way. They just give the error that, yeah, hey, they don't recognize this real estate value. So that's what real estate is. And another thing that's important is, and I should put a bullet here, is real estate is not part of SAML request. It is not part of SAML response. It goes along with it, but it is not part of it. Okay, meaning if single sign-on is being done via HTTP GET, then you will see real estate in query parameter separated from SAML request or SAML response. Okay, so just remember that. Because, and I pointed that out because somehow I have heard some people saying like real estate is inside SAML response. That's actually not correct. Unless, but it turns out not to be the case either, unless if any service provider said, hey, the real estate I give you, please put it back in a SAML attribute. Okay, well then, because of that specific requirement, that will be different. But generally speaking, that is not the case. Okay, so let's revisit this diagram again, and let's look at the SAML initiated single sign-on workflow. So the workflow is still the same, of course, right? But what I'm adding in this diagram is now, after describing SAML requests and relay state to you, this is where they are located. So when a service provider redirects the user to IDP, that's where the SAML request send out along with the relay state if they choose to use it. Then Centrify does this normal thing to authenticate the user, and on success, redirects the user back to service provider with a SAML response. If there is a relay state coming in from service provider, then send it back along with SAML response. Okay, so there's nothing new here really, just to be more explicit on the messages. Okay, so far so good? Any questions so far?
Nope.
Okay, so far we have talked about the workflow, then a little bit on the messages and what it looks like, but sure, when that is all happening, then of course, right, it's magical. But how does that happen, right? I mean, before that happens, right, I talked about configuration earlier. Like in order to get to that stage, in order for these messages to go around like that, right? How does that happen? How to establish this trust between an IGDP and SP? I'll totally just flip it there. All right, so this part is known as SAML integration or configuration. So for developers, so just for some example for developers, and that's what I did before. Well, I still do that. As a developer, it is if there's anyone that is interested in integrating with SAML with Centrify, right? Then I need to do this. Usually, like if you're a developer, then you are very likely the technical contact on Centrify side. And on service provider side, they will send out also a technical person, and you guys will work together to identify these parts out. And if you're a support person, you might get customer request by saying, hey, I want to integrate Centrify as an IDP to this application I'm going to use. But I don't see it in app catalog, and I cannot figure out how to use custom app templates to do that. So like, would you help me? And in that case, you would be pretty much doing the same thing. Figure out, what needs to go into this specific SAML integration to this specific applications and set it up. So what needs to happen is the exchanging of the information. So from IDP, you need to give SP, right, your side of information, your side of things, and SP needs to do the same, right? So simply ask for it, right? Ask SP to provide you the information on their side. Some of them would have documentation already that they can give you and you just follow it. Or in some cases, they actually might not have documentation, but they only have a person to ask. Well, then ask away. So let me step back a little bit, back to, that very simple diagram that I showed you earlier, right? Once again, just between you as an IDP, right? For example, I as an SP, now we want to send things to each other. You need to tell me where to send to, right? And I need to tell you where you can send things to me. I need to ask you where I can send things to you. We'll get to that right away. So here's a breakdown of further what that means of exchanging information is to, well, identify each other. It is like, I need to know who you are. You need to know who I am. And the destinations, right? Well, if you and I send letters to each other, I need to know what address to put on the envelope in order to, right, for the letter to get to you. And same thing for you, right? I have to tell you what address that I'll be receiving from you. Why I'm being so specific on this part is this kind of thing I'm not really think that you could guess, right? You cannot guess my address really. Some of you know that I live in Santa Clara, then that narrows down. Now, if you happen to know what street I live in, right? That still narrows down. You can go, trial by error by sending a letter to every street number and see if I ever reply, then that would be the correct one. But you know what? Just ask me, because I have to give you that address for you to send it directly right away to the correct address. And then also part of it, talk about the certificate and the signature, is that will be part of the configuration. And some other things like authentication criteria, I show you the name ID value in the SAML response several slides ago. Now, what that value should be is actually to be figured out between SP and IDP. And usually how it goes is going to be, you guys must have used enough web application nowadays to know that your username is not always email address, right? Sometimes some systems are flexible enough, are open enough for you to define whatever. But some application only use email address as username. And some doesn't require that, then your username is just a kind of like a short name, right, without a domain. And that's okay. But between SP and IDP, that has to be straightened out during configuration time. And other things like SAML attributes that I mentioned, right? If any that a service provider required, hey, this is the time for them to specify, and IDP are to follow. Then another thing that is important is after all these information exchange, on that, in service provider, that's, to test it out, you need some sort of user on that side, right? So otherwise, single sign-on won't happen, right? On their end, they cannot map to an actual user. So ask for that. A test account or test user. In some cases, more so customer cases, sometimes you might not get to have your own test account, and you might have to ask customer to create a test user for you. Once again, the idea is, right, after all this configuration, you need to test. Okay, so now I'm getting to the pieces inside the SAML response and SAML requests. Some of these are common. I showed you issuer earlier, right? And that is actually another name for the entity ID or entity ID issuer. Both IDP and SP has one, right? It's effectively just a name, more so what it says, ID, identifier of an IDP or SP, just like your name and my name. You have a name, I have my name. So anywhere during configuration, if it is not clear, when someone asks for an issuer, right, or mention issuer, the first thing you need to be more specific and get clarification on is whose issuer are you asking for, right? If they actually spelled out SP entity ID or SP issuer, then okay, that's entity ID of SP. If it is IDP entity ID or IDP issuer, then you know what it is. But just by, we might actually get to see it tomorrow, I'm not sure. But in some integration I've seen, someone is asking for a SAML issuer. I don't know. And that's exactly what I have to do. You have to do too in that situation is which one are you talking about? Okay, now somehow, but that is part of the specification also, SP entity ID, right, is given a special name, audience. Okay, so now for this piece of information, there are actually three names now, right? SP entity ID, SP issuer, and now you just get a special one, audience. They all refer to the same thing. Okay, now in Centrify Cloud with the SAML application template we have, IDP and the TID is generated when the SAML application is created. But for any reason, testing purposes or whatever, if you need to change, you can change that. At the end of the day, you just need to make sure that these values, like on both sides, have to match. Right? That's why this information exchange is, at the end of the day, your information and the same piece of information on the other side has to match, and vice versa. Okay, so that's sender TID, and the next one is destinations. So this is the address I was talking about earlier in the sending letter example. All right, so let's look at SP initial single sign-on first, right? All right, and imagine that diagram again. SP sends user to IDP with a SAML request. Okay, well, that's what we want to happen, possibly with a relay state too, but how does SP know where to send it? During the information exchange, IDP would have given, actually has to give SP a IDP single sign-on URL. Now there is another name for it. There could be different names out there too. So there's another name is called IDP login URL. And what you need to really figure out at the end of the day is what's the function? Like if someone asks for, just say like a throw the URL, hey, what URL you're looking for, right? Ask them about like, if they don't know, right, then follow up by asking, well, what is this URL is supposed to do? Then that will help you figure out which exact URL they're talking about. So same thing the other way around. IDP needs to send a SAML response to SP, but where? Okay, SP must give IDP a URL called assertion consumer service URL. In short term, it is ACS. You'll hear this a lot. If we work together, I will say that a lot, ACS URL. And the function of ACS URL is to receive SAML response and validate it and process it, right? Now, and there are also, again, different names out there. Different service provider could call them differently. But ACS endpoint, but it's still ACS, right? As long as the ACS name is there, this is it. This one, that is easy. But I've seen some others like SAML post back URL. Now that got me thinking a little bit. But once again, and if in doubt, always ask. In this case, well, there's this back here, right? Like if you post back, post what back? The only thing to post back in that workflow would be SAML response. So that ends up to be, that is actually the ACS URL. But once again, you don't have to guess this. You can try because sometimes, something are close enough. You might even see cases where the ACS URL turns out to be the same as the login page URL. But just because of that coincidence doesn't mean that's always the case. So don't assume that. If you see that, you could consider, yourself lucky because that's easy. But that is not always the case. Okay, so that's destination URL and the addresses. So let's come back to this example SAML response. So destination is actually at the root element, right? Meaning after configuration and Centrify SAML app is sending out a SAML response. If you capture this response in a network trace, or there's a preview button in the configuration on the configuration screen, you can actually see the ACS URL configured here, right? So you can visually verify that, like if the ACS URL is configured correctly or not. So the issuer, right? Well, issuer of SAML response is IDP. Therefore, the value is IDP issuer, aka IDP entity ID. Now here's audience. Inside assertion, Here's the audience value. Do you guys still remember what audience means? What does audience mean? Guess you guys are probably on mute. So right, that's a special name given to SP issuer or SP entity ID. All right. So now you kind of see it. If anyone just simply mentioned the word entity or issuer, right? We need to be. We would better be more specific of which one you're talking about. Okay. So let's come back to this diagram again now, because we know a little more term. So on this slide, the only thing new here is really service provider. On their side of configuration, they have a SP entity ID to give you. And you have an IDP entity ID given to them. It is generated from a SAML application, which we will get to see and play with tomorrow. And also the destination. For our SP to send a SAML request to you, you need to give them your IDP single sign-on URL, which is also generated as part of the SAML application, which we'll also get to see tomorrow. And then same thing on the other side for you to send a SAML response. That's actually a typo in the diagram. Back to service provider, they need to tell you the ACS URL. Okay? So what they do? So we are adding more and more pieces in this whole thing. Okay, moving on. So here's the certificate part. So the certificate is used. It's actually another way of saying it is agreed between IDP and SP to use a certain certificate, and both sides configure it that way. And now when you create a SAML applications, it will use a default sign-in certificate that already comes as part of your centralized cloud tenant. But if you choose to use a different one for whatever reason, you can change that. Like there's an upload link you can do there. There's actually another locations in the admin side to do that. But anyway, whenever you change the sign-in certificate, just make sure that this part is same as IDP issuer, right? Is to make sure that the IDP signing certificate configured in SP side also match. Otherwise, there will be error, right? Otherwise, SP will try to validate the signature using a wrong certificate, and of course, the result is going to be negative. One thing to point out is I know that the default signing certificate in each cloud tenant is actually different. So you will normally run into this scenario, but if you ever need to configure a second SAML application to the same service provider, then this might be something you need to be aware of. Because if your first configuration is good, right, things are working, certificates are matching, and if you try to create a second one, more so in a different tenant, right, then that certificate is not going to match by default. So if you ever need that, then you will have to probably use another certificate. You configure in both two of your SAML application as well as on the SP side matching it. But that's a rare case, so I'm just throwing out there that if you ever run into that scenario, I hope you'll remember this line. We'll talk about that a little more in troubleshooting on the third day. Okay, bindings. This one is less important in configuration, I would say, as in this usually doesn't come up, but if it comes up, then it would be a little thing to pay attention to, so I'm telling you that right now. This binding is really, when we talk about sending messages over HTTP, preferably, but via HTTP post or GET. So per SAML specifications, there are several bindings, right? Now, the ones that we are familiar with is HTTP post and GET, which is also known as HTTP redirect in the SAML bindings. And there's another one called artifacts. And I want to tell you that when Centrify send out SAML response to a service provider, it is always post. We have not implemented GET, and we have never had a need to. Okay? But now if you get question about, hey, well, what about from service provider side? When they send in a SAML request, does it have to be post or redirect? Well, guess what? We actually do both. So simply choose one and keep going. However, any other bindings, such as artifacts, are not supported. Okay, so back to the SAML response XML again. Just pointing out, the certificate, the signing certificate, the public key part, when it gets out on SAML response, it is called X509 certificate. Which for those of you who are more familiar with certificate law, X509 certificate is one type of it, or another name of it. So it's actually here inside. And binding doesn't appear here, but I'll show you that in another document later. Okay, during configuration, we also talk about, so what identity value to send, right? Any attributes. So that is, once again, ask service provider to provide. If they are not sure by any chance, then that really might be on their end, they're actually flexible, right? So any username goes, then what we need to figure out with them as part of the integration and configuration is to figure out this mapping, right? Well, what exact value are they looking for? Are they looking for the email address or whatever? On our end, we will have ways to send out the value format, but we need to know what it is first. Now, name ID format is something I will talk about again, but there's actually a name ID format called unspecified. So in all cases where service provider does not specify what name ID format to use unspecified. And for SAML attributes, once again, SP must specify what they are expecting from you. And then from you, you are expected, you must configure the SAML attributes with the exact name. I'm really emphasizing exact all the way down to it has to be case sensitive. And if they tell you there's spacing in between, do it. Okay, don't mess with it. Whatever names they give you, follow it. All right, well, if they end up giving you a wrong name, then right, that's it's on them. But if they give you, so here's some example, right? So the first two are easy, right? But if they give you, hey, attribute name has a camel case like this, just follow it. If they have a space in between, just follow it. If in doubt, of course, you could ask, hey, there's a space in between. Is that supposed to happen? They must tell you if it is supposed to happen or not. Otherwise, it's likely going to be an error. Okay. Now, if you ever come across any service provider that's actually flexible enough to tell you that, it's case insensitive for them, then I would also say consider to be lucky because they're not as picky. But that is not a thing. I mean, don't assume that. Specification says whatever SAML attribute name service provider give to you, you must follow.
So it's worth, Terry, it's worth noting that we actually are case insensitive in our uses of it when we're acting as a service provider.
Pardon me?
When we act as a service provider, our service, we are case insensitive.
Is that Mike?
Yeah, it is.
Okay. Let me point out that this one only covers the Centrify SIDP. The product management part is not part of this. But that's one example. Is up to the service provider. If they are more flexible into handling it, then well, more power for you maybe. So just always follow what service provider tells you. Okay, so here's a summary of all these pieces that to be exchanged between service provider and identity provider. Okay, now I list out all these pieces, and it could get tedious that to ask these pieces one by one. Of course, preferably, even more so with documentation, all these will be listed out. But is there an easier way to exchange these information? Oh, there is. It's called SAML metadata XML. So the specification laid out in a different format, specifically for exchanging information. So IDP could have one, IDP metadata XML, and SP will have his own, called SP metadata XML. And long story short, it combines all the things that I listed out before, which I'll show you some example in the next slide. What I want to point out now is that the use of SAML metadata is entirely optional. So you might come across service provider that will give you SAML metadata XML at a URL. They might give you a file, or they might just give you in XML contents, like what I just showed you, like the whole thing in a string. But that's the medium, right? How this XML could be delivered. But even the use of it is optional. Some service providers don't even use it. They just give you the pieces individually. And that's how the way they implement, which is okay. Now for us, and we'll get to see this tomorrow also, is we have enhanced our UI early last year to actually give our IDP metadata XML in all formats. So whichever way is easier for the service provider you're dealing with, it's already there. Okay, so here's an example IDP metadata XML. I know it's a little small, but I'm not asking you to read into it. I'm just pointing out where the pieces of information are located, right? So for an IDP metadata XML, the entity ID is at the root element, identifying, in this case, your center file. And then there's IDP signing certificate inside XML is going to look like this. And then if there's any name ID format, it can be specified here. And there's these single sign-on surface elements. Actually, also look at the location. That is the IDP single sign-on URL. And next to it, there's the binding. Now, you will see multiple, because in this case, both HTTP post and HTTP redirect are supported. That's why there are two entries. But they are not the same. Look carefully, the binding is different. This metadata are also generated by the SAML application, so there's nothing you need to manually fill out. If you want to change the value, you change the value in configuration and then regenerate this metadata XML. Okay. Next one, this is a sample of SP metadata XML. They look very much the same. Once again, the entity ID is the SP entity ID, which is also known as audience. And then here's the assertion consumer service element, in which the location attribute gives you the ACS URL. And there's also binding. And in this case, it is HTTP post. Okay, so this is what I'm gonna cover today. Any questions so far?
Here. Not yet.
Okay. So these are all the textbook terms that we will be seeing quite often in a real SAML configuration. So that's what I mean by today's a lot of textbook stuff. And tomorrow we're actually going in to Centrify Cloud and configure something. Okay?
We'll have questions once we actually try it, I'm sure.
I'm sure. That will be good. Okay. All right. Looking forward for tomorrow. Part
Thank
2.
you.
So this is the
Thank
end
you.
of part 1. You're welcome. I'll see you again tomorrow.
Bye.
Thank you very
Bye.
much. Bye.